Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is Sal Gilberto from Everbridge, just welcoming you to today's webinar on analyzing performance. It's set to start at the top of the hour, 2 o'clock Eastern, which is in another 2 minutes or so. So please do sit tight, and we will be getting started with the webinar shortly. Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar, Analyzing Performance, Improving Organizational Response. My name is Sal Gilberto. I'm a marketing director here at Everbridge. I'll be your moderator today. So again, welcome to today's webinar. Really quickly, I'll go over the agenda. So there are a few housekeeping items that we are going to cover. Then I will introduce our speaker, Bryan Koon, who you will meet shortly. Bryan will then present the main content, analyzing performance, and we are going to end today's session with a Q&A. So just a couple of items. This question does come up often. So we are recording today's presentation. You will receive an email in the next day or so with a recording of the video and a copy of the slides. So please do keep an eye out for that email. Also should mention, not listed here, we are doing a Q&A at the end of today's presentation. So please do submit your questions through the GoToWebinar control panel throughout the presentation, but we are going to leave those questions until the end, at which time our presenter will try to answer them as best he can. Speaking of presenter, at this point, I'd like to introduce Bryan Koon. Bryan, how are you doing today?
I'm terrific, Sal. Thanks.
No problem. And with that, Bryan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, very good. I am showing my screen right now. So I think, can you see my screen there okay, Sal?
I can. Everything looks good.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good morning on the West Coast. I'm excited to be here today for the fourth in our webinar series. I will tell you that this one is unusual because of where I'm presenting this from. Normally, I've tried to find a nice, quiet office location to do these. Today, however, I am in the Marsh Harbor Airport on Abaco Island in the Bahamas. I'm in the Bahamas this week, working on trying to understand where the Bahamas are in terms of their Hurricane Dorian recovery. And what it looks like right now. So I've spent the day here in Marsh Harbor going around and getting a sense of, first of all, what the destruction looked like and what the response and recovery effort looks like. I will tell you that the response is as bad and worse that you've seen on TV. Basically, I saw no structure that was not impacted by the storm, and many of them completely obliterated. About 80% of the vehicles here on this island were destroyed by the storm. The population has diminished by about 2/3. But I will also tell you that I've seen lots of rebuilding efforts going on. There's lots of governmental organizations that work here, and I would say probably a dozen and a half charitable organizations doing tremendous work. The airport is open. I obviously can find an internet connection and a cellular phone connection, so they are on the path to recovery. But it's going to be a doozy of a recovery. There's going to be a lot of work to go here. But the spirits of the people are high, and I think there's a tremendous desire to rebuild better and stronger than they were before. And so if you have any opportunity to engage with that, I highly encourage it. They're great spirit of the folks here, but they're going to need a whole lot of effort and support in the months and years ahead. And the kind of folks that I know are on this webinar today are just the kind of folks who can help do that. So that's my plug. So I also apologize for any background noise that you may hear from me. And I do have a flight back to Nassau that's going out at 3:20, and I'm on the other side of security. So if I have to bail at some point a tad early to get through there, please forgive me. All right. So as Sal said, this is the fourth in a webinar series that we've been working on. All three of the previous ones are available on the Everbridge website. And if you want to go back and take a look at them, I encourage you to. We did the first one we talked about. We did a situational awareness and common operating picture, where we dealt with a lot of things in terms of how to understand, what the heck's going on in a situation. Their second webinar spent a lot of time taking a look at what tools are available to us today. And, frankly, we have more than we ever have before, and understanding how the intelligence around us fits together in relationship to the built environment. A couple months ago, we did bringing resources to bear during a disaster, and what are the types of things that we can bring in, making sure that we have every resource available to us as we respond and recover and prepare from disasters. And then today, we're going to be kind of focusing on what are we doing once it's passed? Or, this is also applicable to a longer term situation, which is how do we step back and analyze how we've done? How do we go through and say, okay, here's everything we've done. How can we, what went well? What could we do better? How do we want to make sure that we're able to capture all of the positives for future events? And what do we need to tweak going forward? And so that's the purpose of today's, kind of to complete that cycle of this webinar. Some of the highlights of what we're going to talk about today are why should you review? What's the point of it? What good can come of it? How do you properly prepare to do a review? You're going to have a much better opportunity, a much better outcome if you give a lot of forethought into what are the data points you want to capture, what is the information you want to capture, so that when you're in the thick of things, you've already got a plan for doing that. How do you conduct an after action review? There's a plenty of should and should nots, frankly, on how it is that you extract the information that you want to look for in that situation. And then the last piece of it is, now that you've got all that, thought through it all, how do you implement whatever it is that comes out of it? How do you implement the plan, the changes, all of those pieces that come out of it? So that's the overview of what we're going to do today. I'm going to cover it in about 5 steps. Then we'll move on to a discussion and a wrap up, and hear what questions you have. So here's a kind of big picture. Why do we do these? Frankly, this is one of my favorite parts of being an emergency manager, is to be able to go in and really step back, because oftentimes, and when you and all of us have been in the thick of things, you see one aspect of an event. You know what's going on and what you're doing. But even if you've been in charge of the entire event, there's a whole lot of stuff that went on, good and bad, that's now your opportunity to understand how it went, how it fix it. So it's really exciting. It's one of my favorite things to do even today in my current role. We do some contracts with folks. So I did an after action review at an airport a couple of months ago on a security incident, which I found really enlightening. I'm currently working on, and keep an eye out for this because it's coming out soon, a longer term after action of sorts that I've been doing with the National Academies of Science on the hurricane logistics from the 2017 hurricane season logistics for Harvey, Irma, and Maria, where we do a deep dive into how the supply chain worked in those 3 storms, and really pointed out, some of the best practices and some of the things that should be corrected going forward. But again, some of my favorite stuff to do. So why do we do these after actions? One is, as I clearly stated, and you all know, it's reflection of previous performances. We really want to make sure that you're going to have, almost in any event you do, the opportunity for some creative ideas and some things that people did on the spur of the moment. You want to make sure that you truly understand what went on with those, so that you can capture them from the future. How did they work out? And if they were successful, incorporate that into your practices going forward. Oftentimes, the best ideas that we have are as a result of some disaster and trying to find a solution to a problem that none of us have seen before. And if it works, capture it. And in memorializing it allows us to share it not only within our organization, but with our partner organizations as well. And then there's going to be issue corrections. There's, again, with every disaster, things are not always going to go right. You all know that. So let's dig into that. Let's identify what were the causes of it not going right. And if there's a way to make sure that we can correct it going forward, let's do that. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes things go wrong and there's nothing you could have done or can do in the processes to correct it. But if there's one thing or 2 things or whatever that you can tweak, you make sure you want to do that. The second reason you do is because this is a dynamic environment. Um, there's turnover everywhere. There's turnover in your personnel and your staff, within the community, within the environment that you're operating, with the leadership to whom you are reporting on these situations. The hazard themselves change. The capabilities of the organization's responding change. And so basically, one disaster is the only shot you're ever going to get at that disaster. No tornado is going to be the same as any other tornado, or hurricane, wildfire, earthquake, what have you. And so you want to extract as much information from that as you can and feed that back into the cycle. One of the best ways to get up to speed on how to operate in a disaster environment is to read those after action reviews. Go in there and find out went through there, so that you have a base of knowledge from which to operate. And so that's another a great reason to do after action reviews. The third is your stakeholders expect it. Your leadership expects you to analyze how you did and improve going forward. Your customers, for many of you, that's citizens, expect you to get better. They will forgive a mistake one time, but they certainly don't want you to repeat it going forward. So your stakeholders at all different levels expect you to make sure that you are going through an appropriate after action review and memorializing the best practices and eliminating those errors. And then frankly, the last one, the coordinating entity part. And this one is specifically for those folks who are in an organization in which you are utilizing the manpower and the capabilities of other organizations. So for many of you, that's an emergency management organization, where you're reliant upon the folks from the Department of Transportation or the Department of Health or the Department of Commerce, what have you. You are the only one who has the ability to bring all of those people together and have this kind of conversation. And so that's really an important part, to make sure that all of those pieces are put together, because sometimes the case is that those people from the Department of Transportation have no idea what was going on the private sector side, or on the the shelter and feeding side, or on the emergency response side. And so the after action review is their opportunity to come in and see what everybody else was doing and discover, say, aha, we didn't know that was going on, but if we did, here's how we would have done it differently. And that's a great opportunity for you to strengthen connections between those organizations, and establish some links that may not have been possible without the after action review being conducted. All right, so now let's move on to the steps. As I said before, you don't want to go through an entire event and then say, okay, let's do an after action without having done any kind of planning. You will get a less than ideal after action, because frankly, at that point, you won't have easy access to data. You're going to be reliant upon people's recollection. You're going to probably have less than 100% participation from all of the people that were involved. So you really want to think ahead of time and prepare for and communicate what it is that you're going to be looking for in that after action. So think through what information is necessary to evaluate the response. You go through and say, these are the metrics, these are the data points, these are the ideas that we want to make sure that we know, so that when we come back on the backside, we can capture it appropriately and come up with mechanisms for capturing that data, and communicate that to everybody. Make sure, the best thing you can do is ahead of time say, hey, in the after action review, here's the kind of things we want you to think about, so that they are, constantly thinking about that as they go through it, and have some way to formalize the data capture for that piece of it. Another thing is, think about, how do you as an organization measure your improvement over the long term? And so you really want to make sure that you've got a great way to capture that data, and if possible, quantify that data, so that you can not only say how you've improved from the last tornado to this tornado, but how you've improved as an organization as a response during the last 10 tornadoes, and try to establish that up front, so that you're able to keep the same mechanism and the same data points throughout. You don't want to decide halfway through that you were measuring the wrong thing and have to start from scratch. So considered thought early on as to what that data looks like and what those points look like will allow you to have a much better database of information that over long term, again, you can measure yourself. And then, frankly, that last piece of it, what metrics are important to your stakeholders? Um, that's going to require some conversation, because what you as an organization consider to be important might be irrelevant to somebody else, or it might be the most important thing to somebody else. I will tell you from my experience, when I was serving as a state director, the governor, particularly the governor's staff, and even more particularly the governor's communications staff, um, what they consider to be an extremely important point, to me, frankly, not that much, because I knew that it wasn't relevant necessarily, or what I considered relevant to the overall outcome of the event. But to those people who are having to write the press releases and defend whatever we were doing in front of the press corps, it was extremely relevant. And so think through those things. Talk to the comms people, talk to the different organizations, and find out what data points they want to capture as well. So just on the back end, just as on the back end of an after action, an event, when you're doing the after action, you involve everybody. Get everybody involved on the front end as well, and understand their viewpoints and their data points, because it's going to make the after action so much better. If you assume what they want, you might get close, but frankly, I think you'll be leaving some stuff on the table. And so go through, find out what's important to them. Continuing on with the step one, get ready piece of it. Some of what you're going to do there is going to be quantifiable data. Those things that you can say, we evacuated, for example, 5,000 people. We notified 75,000 people. We made 14,000 meals. We used 6,000 gallons of gas. Stuff that's easy to capture. Other stuff's going to be not measurable. It's going to be the softer skills of it. How is our communications, to our citizenry? What was the reaction of them to hearing this kind of information, etc. You want to, wherever possible, quantify that, and it's going to take a little while on some of those things to think about how you do it. But if you're able to, as I note here, it's going to be much easier to capture, and there will be less subjectivity on the back end. So if you can remove as much subjectivity as possible, you get a whole lot better opportunity to track that information over time. If all you're able to do is put it down in words, you're not going to be able, it's going to continue to be objective over time. So again, think through how can you do that. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated. As I say here, if you're, for the non-quantifiable information, if you can take it and provide some boundaries, some bookends around that, and then provide, say, a grade or a rating, thumbs up, thumbs down, that could work. And so think through, something you would see like on a personnel evaluation form, where you say, this person is a Cat 5 person. They always go above and beyond. They come to work early, they leave late, they do great work, down to Category 1 person, which is hardly ever here, and actively works to sabotage the organization all the way through. So if you can kind of go through those pieces of information, which are not on the face of them quantifiable, and provide some buckets into which you can put them, as little as 2 buckets, as many as however you want, and then explain that to people and actively grade it throughout, then again, you can track those kinds of things over time. Next step is develop the protocols and processes to do all of that, and disseminate that. It's going to be, you're going to have to do that ahead of time, so that when you ever get, whenever you get the call for EOC activation, or you get the bang, or whatever it is that kicks you off, that you can start immediately. Because many of the most important data points that you're going to capture are at the very beginning of an event. And so you want to work and have those things rock solid, ready to go, and go hand in hand with the activation process. So go through and think about, they should be integrated into your EOC activation process. It should be, if you can, step 1, activate the EOC. Step 2, start the after action review data capture effort. It's going to take, and the second part of that is, in some cases, you need people or resources dedicated to doing that. There is always the tendency in these situations, when you are running 100 miles an hour and you got whatever it is bearing down on you, to utilize every single body you can find on the operation. If you do that, you sell yourself short on the back end. So think through what it is that you need in terms of capturing this kind of information, and work with whoever it is that helps you with those staffing for these events, and help them understand the importance of that data capture and why it is that you want to do that and how it is that it's going to help them be successful going forward. And so you may be able to pull resources from organizations or places that you were not previously because you're going to have them dedicated to this after action review. And they would be the kind of folks who wouldn't be good operationally anyway. So give this some thought. Think about, what agencies do you work with? What parts of the business do you work with or government do you work with who would be good at this? And then bring them ahead of time, train them on the protocols, train them on the processes, and make them part of the team. And so that's my recommendation is, again, pre-working this front of it gives you a much better conclusion on the back end. And then lastly, on the step one piece of it, just some examples of quantifiable data. I already covered some of it, but how long did it take you to activate the EOC? How many people responded to your emergency notification if you have the ability? First of all, how many of them went through? How many people responded to it? What percent of the population is under evacuation order? That's a pretty big metric that every one of you would have interface with. Forecast accuracy over time, shelter readiness, power restoration time, National Guard readiness, individual rescued. I missed a lot of these because when I thought through some of these were the immediate ones that I know that the comms folks look at, that you see in the daily situation reports, that the public understands. And so, again, if you use these as some of the metrics that you're following and have a plan for how to measure them and improve them over time, the perception of not just the perception, but the reality of how you deal with these disasters is going to improve. So this is just some idea of this. The other thing that I want to note here is oftentimes during the emergency disaster itself, you're dealing with these in raw numbers. On the back end, as you prepare for the after action review, you will have the opportunity to put these into a status that allows you to better understand how things went. And so, here you have a map showing you some evacuation areas. You've got some open, close, partially indicators there. You have another one showing you some readiness over time. Take that as much as you can, and I think I'll cover this more a little bit later on, but put it into a graphical format. So take those raw things and smooth it a little bit to allow the audience who's going to be participating in your after action to better understand what went on. Raw numbers is good, but if you take a little time, particularly as you prepare for the after action and make them user-friendly, you'll get better outcomes. Okay, so let's move on to step two, capturing the data itself. You've gone through, you understand what it is that you want to do. How do you make sure that you get it down in whatever format that you want to get it down? And this could be, on paper, perhaps you have a computer system, whatever it is. How do you make sure you've got it? I covered the first one already, which is that dedicated internal staff. Even if it's one person, somebody to really kind of pay attention to what's going on, and make sure that even if it's an automated process, that the automated process is working right. But as much as possible, use that internal staff. If you have the ability, bring in more people. One of the things that we would do oftentimes at our large scale exercises and our large scale events would be hire a team, frankly, to come in there and spread around and work with the different emergency support functions, the different leaders within the organization, follow them around and try to better understand not only what were they doing, but what were they seeing, what were the data points they were considering, and how was that impacting the decisions they were making. That really can help provide you with the insight that you're looking for on the after action review. It's one thing in the after action review to say, well, the director ordered an evacuation at 0820. It's another thing to be able to say, the director got the forecast at 8 a.m. He saw the inundation for that. He spoke with the Department of Transportation and understood the evacuation routes. He saw that there was some construction in this area, and he spoke with the governor's office, and they ran through 3 different scenarios, and they made the decision that the one at 0820 was going to be the most effective evacuation that they could do. And that is a far more fulsome data point than the first one I gave. So the more people you can put towards this and understanding all the different aspects regarded to it, the better you're going to be able to review the outcomes and how effective they were on the back end. The second piece of it, if you can, use somebody who's not within your organization, because it does provide objectivity. There is a tendency when you're grading yourself, to not be, you sometimes you'll find people going a little soft on it, sometimes it's a little overly hard. If you can bring in fresh eyes, I find it to be a great way to go, because not only will fresh eyes be objective in your performance and the process themselves, because they are not invested in developing the process, they're not invested in you, but they will also not fully understand the processes that you're using, and they will ask questions, and they will dig, and they will ask for more explanations of it. And if your folks can provide those explanations and help them, it'll help you evaluate how well they know what's going on there. So again, if you're able to bring in objective reviewers from outside, I think you get a better outcome. Secondly, is let people know from the outset, and preferably even beforehand, there will be a review, either an ongoing or after action review, and how it's going to work. It helps in a lot of different ways. One, it engages them in the process, because now they understand that at the end of the day, all of this is going to be thrown together and taken a look at. And so they're going to make sure that they're capturing the data appropriately and helping you through that process of it. And they're also going to be keeping that in the back of mind, that they want to make sure that they're doing their best in all of this. Give them the access to the information as you get ready for the after action review, because it will do a couple of things. One, it will help them get their head back around it, because sometimes you might do a hot wash that's immediately after an event, but more often than not, you're going to do an after action that is some period of time after the event themselves. And so providing them access to the information throughout is going to help them get their heads back into where they were during that storm, and give them better prepared to have conversations during the review itself. These are team building opportunities. As I said earlier, oftentimes during an emergency, particularly if in an emergency operations center, you know what's going on in the command room or the infrastructure room or the DoD coordination room or what have you, but you're not seeing the bigger picture. So this is an opportunity to get people together, have conversations about what's going on with the entity as a whole. That does a great deal towards building the team building effort for the entire emergency response team. And then think through and have some serious conversations about this one, the understand and minimize unintended consequences. So, for you, this may be a simple process of, listen, we responded to, hurricane, whatever, we want to do better at it. But some of the response organizations, some of the people that you were engaging with through this may have a different set of parameters under which they operate. They may have a regulatory environment. There may be a legal environment. There may be some other rules under which they play that this information is impactful to them. Know what that is ahead of time. Try not to wade into something that's going to cause harm to somebody and you did not mean to. So again, talk to those folks and say, here's the kind of information we want to capture, as we want to talk about. Is this problematic for you? They're going to happily tell you that, and I think be proud and pleased, frankly, that you've engaged that ahead of time. And then the last part of it, capturing the data, it's imperative that you keep a consistent throughout. As I said earlier, much of that data is going to be captured at the beginning of the event, but you also want to make sure that it's captured consistently throughout the event. If it don't capture the data or have the team on board is going to do the evaluations for 18 hours if you're running 24-hour days. You want to make sure that you're capturing the information throughout so that you can review the throughout. Mitigate the personality-driven results, as I said already. If you can find an objective staff from an external entity, or you've got more quantifiable information that you're capturing, you can eliminate those personality-driven results. And again, same protocols throughout the event as well. If you change the protocols or the processes midstream, you can't evaluate appropriately how the entire event went. So try to keep the same thing from beginning to end throughout the event. All right, let's move on to step 3. So now event is done, or as I said earlier, you're in the midst of a longer term event and you've taken a pause to try to see, how did the entire thing work. So the conducting the review itself. Now, I know many of you have been in an after action review, probably most of you. I would wager, though, that a far smaller group of you has had the opportunity to stand up in front of everybody and try to orchestrate it. And frankly, I said orchestrate, uh, and I kind of compare that to conducting an orchestra. I have stood in front of many after action reviews, and the first few minutes of them really set the tone for the entire event. Um, because frankly, if it starts off and nobody's talking and the information is not being shared, it's going to be hard to be successful in that. So you've got to create the right environment so that people feel the opportunity to share the information and to have an open and honest discussion about what went right, what went wrong, and how to improve. And so conducting the review itself, I think is a really important something to focus on. So I'm going to go through these bullet points here and talk about a couple other things as well. First of all, don't wait until they walk in that door to give them the raw material. As much as you can, provide read ahead material, provide the actual data itself to the groups that are going to be there and engaged in it, because it's going to do a couple of things. One, like I said, it allows them to get their head back in the game and thinking about whatever it was that was going on at that time, so they're ready to talk about it. It also gives them an opportunity to correct the record. You will probably have some things in there that weren't right. So if they can see that ahead of time, correct it, you're going to save a whole lot of time in the event itself, because there's nothing worse than being an after action review and laying out a point of conversation or a data point only to be told, hey, that's not what happened, because then you're going to get derailed and you're going to spend precious time trying to fix that on site. Do it ahead of time. Get them the information and let it get it squared away before you start. The second piece of it allows them to do their internal review and analysis. So you want to be able to talk oftentimes in these big picture wise. You don't want to dive into the minutia perhaps of what the DOT people were seeing. And I keep saying DOT people, but it's in my head when I'm picturing an EOC, they were immediately on my right hand side. Think through and allow those individual teams to kind of do a mini AAR hot wash themselves. So when they come there, they're able to talk on a more global view about the entire event itself. And again, the rest of the room's not necessarily going to be very excited about the intricacies of their operating. They are involved. They are interested in the larger outcome of whatever it is they are working on. The second piece of this, and I talked about this a little bit earlier as well, where possible, connect those data points. You're going to have a lot of data points, and we already showed a lot of those earlier. But where you can say, here's how we think those connected, and even show it graphically. So think through what those connections are. So for example, here's the hotel occupancy rate, here's the shelter occupancy rate, here's what we saw in terms of fuel availability, here's what we saw in terms of traffic congestion, and here's what we saw in terms of areas that were evacuated. Those all connect to each other. And so if you're able to show that in a way that people can start drawing the connections, you're going to get a lot further on. You don't want to just talk about, okay, we opened 76 shelters and then move on and say, okay, 80% of the gas stations were closed. You want to talk about those. You want to group those things as much as possible that directly or even potentially indirectly impact each other during the event. If you can do that and do it ahead of time, even better. It generates a much better conversation during the event itself. All right, so now you're in the room with these folks. A few points here. Make sure it's timely. You don't want to, you can do a short hot wash immediately after an event. But frankly, sometimes your folks are going to be burned out and need a break. So take a little time, and you will know what is the right amount of time based on whatever the event is and whatever the operating environment is. But it could be a day, could be a week, could be a month. It really depends upon what it was that you've just gone through. But you don't want to go too far down the road, because then the details start getting fuzzy and people are moving on to their, the next disaster, their next job, whatever the case may be. So again, think ahead of time about when it is that you're going to do the after action review. You probably even want to disseminate that towards the beginning of the event itself so that people can be prepared for that. Second is facilitating the discussion. And as I said a little bit earlier, that's important. You really want to make sure that you are engaging the audience. and one of the ways that, one of the couple of things I try to do, first of all, you never want a Monday morning quarterback these things. You want to recognize what those folks were going through during that situation, the stress they were under, the information they had, the expectations that were put upon them. Don't try to 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 say, hey, here's what you should have done. You really want to make sure that you're thinking through all of those factors as they were doing that, and focus wherever possible. And this should be the default, frankly, on the process instead of the person, because that's what you can improve. You have some opportunities to change the people, but you have a tremendous opportunity to improve the process. And so, wherever possible, dig into what was the process that resulted in this outcome. How can we either memorialize that great process or improve that deficient process going forward? So those are, a couple of pieces of advice. Is, again, try to depersonalize it. You definitely don't want to sit there and point fingers at people or cast blame. You want to focus on, again, as many objective details as possible so that people, again, continue to contribute to the conversation. And also, the other piece of it, on the flip side of it, if there were exceptional performances, talk about those. So minimize talking about an individual perhaps screw up, but if somebody went above and beyond or did really well, absolutely call that out. Because again, that's going to help improve the overall atmosphere, and really try to highlight some of those. And frankly, you, as a manager over these kinds of things, are going to want to know where those great performances come through. One, so that you can record it, and recognize it. But second, sometimes you may be led to believe that your process is good when in fact it was simply a superhuman effort by the person who was implementing it. And that the next time, if you don't have that superhuman doing that, it will fail. Um, and so you do want to call out the great performances to make sure, again, that you can recognize them and that your processes will work even if you don't have a superhuman performance. Third, engage all the stakeholders. Not all of them contributed in the same way to that event, but they did make the time and effort to be there. So as you were able, engage them all. Also, you will recognize that you're going to have the loudmouths and the always talkers. Then you're going to have some people who haven't said anything. So you will, as the conductor of this orchestra, have to call on those and kind of pull some information. So have some pointed questions ready to go, if you know that some people aren't going to contribute very much. I've already hit on this a little bit. Conduct in a manner that maximizes open and honest participation. If you can make this a non-retributional as possible, you will get people to highlight things that they could have done better or they just absolutely did wrong, so that you are able to capture that. But you've got to have the right environment for them to be able to feel safe in doing so. And then finally, the last piece of this thing, there needs to be an outcome. There's got to be something that comes out of this. It can't just be a nice conversation amongst friends. There has to be somebody sitting there, or multiple people scribing this, capturing this. If you can empower them to ask clarifying questions or seek additional information if necessary, even better. And then get something back to those participants so that they, again, know what their time and effort resulted in. You're going to spend an hour, 2, 3, a day, whatever. Give them something beyond that, to help recognize what they went through and feed back into what their thoughts were. And that takes us on to step 4. What do we do after the review? First piece of it, fairly straightforward. You're going to write it all up. Now, it says straightforward, write up all the findings, but frankly, there's going to be some skill on here because you're going to try to take what was a whole lot of different data points and a whole lot of different ideas and thoughts and interjections, and try to make it a readable, interesting document. And it does need to be a readable, interesting document because you want this thing to be something that somebody who wasn't there, can pull off the shelf and get a feel for what happened, and all the conversation that happened during that after action. Now, it doesn't need to be a novel. You're not writing a screenplay here, but it does need to be something that is appealing, because if it's not appealing, then no one's going to read it, and it will be a useless document. So put some thought into how it is that you're going to take all of these raw pieces and build something that produces something that's of use. And there's tons of examples out there. So, I just Googled AAR, I think, to get some of the images on the right-hand side here. Do the same. Flip through them, find some that are compelling, find some that are less than compelling, and, use them as your model. Recognize, however, that, again, this is going to take some time. This is going to take some time and effort. And so you go back to step one in preparing for the after-action review, consider how much time and effort this is going to take. This is not you're going to be able to do in your spare time. This is not I'm going to work on it after work for 30 minutes. This could be a fairly heavy lift depending on the kind of event you're dealing with. So figure out how you're going to resource and staff that well in advance. Second piece of this, and this is also a challenging piece of it. You've got all these ideas, you've got all these different thoughts. Excuse me. Now, who's going to make the recommendations? Some of them will be generated within the room itself, and that's great. If you can get to that point in the room itself, terrific. Some of them, however, will not. Some of them are going to say, hey, this went badly. I don't know how to fix it. Now you, or whatever organization is responsible for this, needs to figure out, how do we come up with a solution for this? So think through who's going to do that. Is it going to be you yourself? I don't recommend it. Is it going to be a panel of experts? Are you going to engage the stakeholders? Who's going to be the person or the group or the group of groups that says, here's the recommendations we have coming out of this, and here's why? Who's going to identify the best practices? Same idea. And then finally, who's going to be the one that says, this is what we're going to do? This is here's what happened. Here's what went badly. Here's how we're going to fix it. Somebody has to identify who that is that says, this is what we're going to do going forward. The better you can identify ahead of time, the better you're going to be. Okay, and then finally, after the review, you want to get that thing out there. Again, this is only as good as your ability to have people read, understand, and utilize this document. So get it out there. If you can put it out on your website, you can print it out and hand it out to people. Whatever it is, do as much as possible. Now, for some of you, that's not possible. It's going to be, sometimes you'll have information there that is classified or sensitive. Sometimes your organization simply doesn't share information like that. That's understandable. Do it as broadly as you can. Not only will it improve your organization and your outcomes, it improves the profession. I think that many of you would probably, like me, you read these things. You read about events you weren't involved with at all because, frankly, you know that it's going to help you in your professional efforts. So, again, put it out there as widely as possible so people can utilize it. And then finally, step 5, incorporate those changes. It's out there. The AR is done. People are reading it. You've got things you want to improve. You've got things you want to change. What's the timeline for it? Sometimes timelines are pretty straightforward. We're going to get it done by next hurricane season. We're going to get it done by next wildfire season. We're going to get it done before the next legislative session, whatever it is. But put a goalpost there so people have something to shoot for. Assign individuals who are going to be incorporating those best practices and improvements. Who's going to sit down with the AR on one side of their desk and your processes and policies and checklists on the other side, and making sure that they're in there. How are you going to drive those changes? How are you going to train people about them? How are you going to get your stakeholders engaged? So again, think through, build that into your timeline. Don't say we're going to, don't say that by June 1st, we're going to have this built into our checklist, only to recognize then that you have not given yourself any time to do an exercise or train before hurricane season starts. If you can, do an exercise, test them, and make sure that they work like you think they're going to work. And go in and review those, highlight those things. The next time, if you're able, when an activation occurs, you might want to just throw up on a screen, hey, here's some of the things that have changed since the last time you were here, and here's why. Kind of bring back up that AAR, remind people of some of those, and highlight the changes there. And so that's it. 5 simple steps. Frankly, I have simplified this tremendously, and I've put a couple of resources there. The HC will give you a really detailed way of how to do those kinds of things. The top one is to highlight this one from the Harvard Business Review. This is not limited to emergency management. It's not limited to disaster security. This is something that you see both in lots of different organizations, entities, businesses, athletics, etc. So the HBR, Harvard Business Review article is pretty interesting read. The bottom one is an interesting, I pulled out from the military, Department of the Army, September 1993. You can see that one's dated. There's hardly any graphics in that, and it's kind of plain looking, but I think it has some terrific ideas, similar to some of the ones I talked about today. And then again, lots of resources on that. I have vastly simplified it just to highlight some of the big picture ideas. You're going to really want to dig into the details as they are specific to your organization, your entities, and make sure that you can come up with a plan and course of action that is appropriate for you. So that's those are all the slides I got for today. Sal, I'm going to open it up for questions on this, or anybody's got any questions about what I'm seeing down here in the Bahamas or anything else, I'd be happy to talk about it.
Sounds good. Thank you. So just for our audience, if you'd like to ask questions, please type a question into the GoToWebinar control panel in the Q&A section. Also, just reminding everybody that this was part 4 of our critical event management web series. So I listed the other 3 parts. When we send this out, and we send the recording of this webinar out, we'll also send links to our previous webinars. And I know, Bryan, you're kind of at an airport. You have probably strapped for time, but one question that came in is, can you get a little bit more specific about when the governor's office was asking you for information that you thought kind of wasn't relevant?
Well, thanks, Sal. That's a fun question. I appreciate it. Again, recognize that your view of the situation is unique and different than most people's view of the situation. When I keep going back to the stuff, the hurricanes I would deal with in Florida. I would kind of think through, my point of reference was, what were my parents' experience in that storm? What is the information they see on the news? What do they see firsthand? And I think through what information is important to them. Now, I may have 10 different explanations for why the gasoline price might have gone up, or they couldn't find the water they wanted at Publix, or why we ordered an evacuation for this area instead of that area. And I thought, I would kind of use that to gauge my conversations with the governor's office. The governor's office, their job is to take frankly, the very detailed information that you provide and massage it in a way that they know that the majority of citizens and the press wants to hear. Because first of all, there's kind of the stuff that they're always used to hearing, and you talk about it whether it's frankly important or relevant or not. And then what are the kind of the current events of the day in terms of all the other things that are going on. So I'm trying to think of things that were important, and that they would ask for, but weren't necessarily relevant to the discussion. Shelter. I'll just make one up. Number of shelters open. Number of shelters open as itself, probably an important talking point for the governor's office, because they like to demonstrate that they're leaning forward, that they're taking appropriate actions, that they are ready to go. But without context, if I said there were 37 shelters open, governor's office might, that might sound good, but is that 37 shelters that are packed to the gills and we don't have enough room for 30,000 people, or do we have 37 shelters and 14 people in all of it? So a lot of times the relevancy of those would get stripped out, but over time, as you engage with them and have a better understanding of the type of data points that they're looking for, you can help give it to them, but you can also use it as an opportunity to help educate them and also the press and the general public about what it is they should be focusing on. So use it as an opportunity to not only provide what it is they want and are looking for, but what they should be asking about in those kind of situations.
Sounds good. So a reminder, please submit your questions. This question did come up, so I will review this. Yes, we are recording today's session. We will make the slides and the video available for download. Look for an email from us tomorrow or perhaps the next day. Give us 2 full business days to process that, but we'll try to get that out as soon as possible. Bryan, I know you have to go quickly, but maybe one more question that has come in.
Sure.
Yeah. I think the Bahamas will proactively change the building code to bring the elevation of homes up and increase the standards for wind. And if so, do you think that this will change codes in the US?
So I hope so. I will tell you that the opinion of the taxi driver that we had today to drive us around was absolutely yes. He was all for it. What I saw today was that well-constructed buildings fared far better than poorly constructed ones. I saw a church that was a metal building that just utterly obliterated, and I saw strongly built concrete buildings that had some minor damage, which you're going to expect when you have 200 plus mile an hour winds, but overall protected their inhabitants. I saw storm surge just demolish places, and I saw buildings that were elevated and higher elevations do just fine. Bahamas generally follows the Miami-Dade building code. But I think this is an opportunity. We'll see. I hope there's an appetite for them to exceed the Miami-Dade building code and really show what you can do if you build strongly. I think there's an appetite for it right now. As most of you who have been engaged with this anywhere before, the challenge comes when you start talking dollars and you try to find, you're working on housing solutions and building solutions for folks who don't have an unlimited wallet. So you've got to come up with what is the best solution for them as they rebuild. Absolutely, it should be as strong as possible. Hopefully it will end up as strong as feasible, and the feasible is pretty close to that possible piece of it. I'm excited. I'm always excited in these situations. I hate seeing the devastation, and the devastation here is immense. But these often drive some terrific improvements and innovations, and so I'm excited about the opportunity for that to occur here. And thank you for that question.
So one last question before I let you go.
Okay.
This is a good one. What is a good practice to conducting organizational response in evaluating new technologies procedures?
Wow. Okay. I'm gonna have to think about that one. So you want to? So this is, I think you're trying to say, did we tried out something new here? How did it work? Did I capture that right? Or we got a new technology or new process or new procedure here? I think if that's the question, my would be similar in that as much as you can ahead of time, think about what it should do, and then measure it against that standard. And then you've got something that you can, going forward, you'll have a baseline. But if you can, don't just say, hey, let's try it out and see how it works. Say, hey, let's try it out, and here's how I think it's going to work. I think we're going to be able to do X, Y, Z. And so you've got something against which to. So as much as possible, don't just throw it out there, see what sticks. Throw it out there, walk through how it should work, and then measure it against that. So that would be my recommendation on that piece of it, is at least give you something to against which you can measure it.
Sounds good. Okay. That is all then. I'll let you, Bryan. I know you're hard at work.
All righty.
The questions that have come in. Thank you so much for participating in our webinar, and thank you to our audience. Again, we will be sending the recording of this webinar and the slides out probably tomorrow, but give us at least until Friday. End of the year is coming. That's part of why we wanted to run kind of the after action reporting webinar in Q4. But we will also send out all of our critical event management webinars that we've conducted this year, and hopefully they will help you in all aspects of your emergency response. So thank you, and Bryan, thank you.
Thank you, Sal. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.